Welcome. Tonight, we follow the slow and steady journey of early humans as they begin to move across the world, long before borders, cities, or maps. Small groups traveled across vast landscapes, following food, water, and changing climates. Step by step, generation by generation, they spread into new environments, adapting as they moved, learning as they went. Tonight, we explore what this long journey may have felt like. From quiet mornings on open land, to long nights beneath unfamiliar skies. The first steps into the unknown. Long before cities, before language as we know it, before history could be written, there were only footsteps. Not roads. Not paths. Just footsteps. Small groups of humans, no more than a few dozen at a time, moved slowly across vast and unfamiliar land. There was no destination in the way we think of it today. No map. No final place waiting for them. Only movement. They followed what they understood. The rhythm of animals. The shifting of seasons. The quiet signals of the land itself. A drying riverbed might mean it was time to leave. A sudden abundance of grazing animals might mean it was time to stay, just a little longer. But nothing lasted. And so they moved again. At night, the world became something entirely different. Without artificial light, the skies stretched endlessly above them, dense with stars. The same stars, night after night, slowly becoming familiar. Not as constellations with names, but as patterns. Markers. Quiet guides. They didn't navigate, in the modern sense. But they remembered. A certain cluster of stars always appeared just before the cold season. Another seemed to rise when the animals began to migrate north. Over time, these patterns became part of their understanding of the world. Not written down, but lived. Their bodies changed with the journey. Walking wasn't just something they did, it was what they were built for. Long legs. Efficient strides. The ability to travel great distances with minimal energy. Even their sweating, something most animals can't do well, allowed them to move under the hot sun for hours longer than the creatures they hunted. This wasn't random. It was adaptation. Humans became endurance walkers. Persistence hunters. Creatures that didn't need to be the fastest, just the most patient. And patience, over thousands of years, became survival. But movement wasn't always a choice. Sometimes it was forced. A region that once provided everything, water, plants, animals, could slowly begin to fail. Rain patterns would shift. Temperatures would drop, or rise. What was once predictable became uncertain. And uncertainty, in a world like this, was dangerous. So they left. Not knowing if the next place would be better. Only knowing they couldn't stay. There is a quiet kind of courage in that. To walk away from everything familiar. With no guarantee of anything ahead. Just instinct. And hope. And so, step by step, generation by generation, they spread. Not in a single wave. But in countless small movements, barely noticeable in the moment. A group drifting slightly farther than the last. A child growing up in a place their grandparents had never seen. And over time, those small movements became something much larger. A slow unfolding of humanity across the earth. The shape of the earth decides the path. The earth was not a blank canvas. It never was. Every step early humans took was shaped by something larger than them. Something unmoving, yet always changing. The land itself. Mountains rose like walls, massive, silent barriers that could not simply be crossed. Their peaks were cold, thin, and dangerous. To climb them meant risking everything. So most didn't. Instead, they moved around them, following valleys, tracing the edges. Slowly learning the natural corridors carved by rivers and time. These pathways weren't chosen. They were discovered. Rivers, in particular, became lifelines. They offered water, yes, but also direction. To follow a river was to follow life itself. Plants grew thicker along its banks. Animals came to drink. The land was softer, more forgiving. And so, humans followed. Sometimes for days. Sometimes for generations. A river could guide an entire lineage without them ever realizing it. But not all land was welcoming. There were vast deserts, dry, endless stretches where the sun pressed down without mercy. Water was scarce. Shade, even more so. To cross a desert required timing, knowledge, and resilience. Some groups made it. Others didn't. Those who survived carried that knowledge forward, not as written instruction, but as memory. Stories. Instincts. Warnings passed down in quiet ways. And then there were the coastlines. Where land met water, something different happened. The environment softened. Food was more predictable: fish, shellfish, seabirds. The tides themselves became a kind of clock. A rhythm that could be learned. Here, survival didn't always depend on chasing herds across open land. Sometimes, it meant staying close to the edge. Over time, some groups began to move along these coasts. Slowly. Always within reach of the sea. This kind of migration was different. More stable. More consistent. Less about chasing, and more about following. And then, during colder periods, something extraordinary happened. The world changed shape. As temperatures dropped, vast amounts of water became locked in ice. Massive glaciers spread across continents. Sea levels fell, sometimes by hundreds of feet. And when the oceans receded, land appeared where there had once been none. Places we now think of as separate were once connected. Bridges of earth stretching between continents. Not permanent, but long enough. One of these land bridges, now long gone, connected what we call Asia and North America. A wide, cold expanse of grassland. Windswept. Harsh. But passable. Animals moved across it first. Massive herds, following ancient instincts. And where the animals went, humans followed. They didn't know they were crossing into a new continent. There was no concept of continents. No sense of crossing into something new. It was just more land. More distance. More unknown. And so they walked. Across a place that no longer exists. Into a world that would eventually become home. The earth guided them. Not with intention, but with opportunity. Openings. Windows of time that would close just as quietly as they appeared. And those who moved when the path was open became the first to arrive. Becoming different, slowly. At first, there was no real difference. Not in the way we think of it now. The earliest humans who began these migrations looked largely the same. They shared the same origins, the same basic features, the same ways of surviving. But distance does something quiet. Something almost invisible. When groups separate, they begin to change. Not all at once. Not even within a single lifetime. But slowly, across generations. A group that settles in a colder region begins to face new pressures. Less sunlight. Longer winters. Bitter winds. Over time, bodies respond. Skin becomes lighter, allowing more sunlight to be absorbed. A small but important change, helping the body produce what it needs to survive in low-light environments. In hotter regions, the opposite unfolds. Strong sunlight. Intense heat. Here, darker skin becomes an advantage, protecting against the harsh effects of constant exposure. Again, not a decision. Not a choice. Just adaptation. Even body shapes begin to shift. In colder climates, bodies tend to become more compact, holding heat more efficiently. In warmer climates, bodies often become longer, leaner, better at releasing heat into the surrounding air. These changes weren't planned. They weren't even noticed in the moment. To the people living through them, nothing felt different. Life simply continued. But over thousands of years, those small changes added up. And it wasn't just physical. Ways of living began to diverge too. A group near the coast might become deeply familiar with tides, fish, and shoreline patterns, building tools suited for that life. Another, far inland, might follow herds across open plains, learning to track, to endure, to anticipate movement over vast distances. The environment shaped behavior, and behavior shaped culture. Language, too, began to drift. Not suddenly, but gradually. A sound changes here. A meaning shifts there. A word becomes something new. And over many generations, groups that once spoke the same language could no longer understand each other at all. Still, they were all human, connected by something deeper than appearance or language. A shared origin, a shared journey. But that connection became harder to see. As distance grew, so did difference. And yet, no matter how far they traveled, or how much they changed, they all carried the same quiet inheritance. The instinct to move, to adapt, to survive. Migration didn't just spread humans across the earth. It reshaped them. Gently, constantly. Turning one shared beginning into many different ways of being. The moment some chose to stay. For thousands of years, movement was constant. It wasn't questioned. It wasn't debated. It was simply how life worked. You moved, or you struggled. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. In certain places, the land offered more than it once had. Not just enough to survive, but enough to remain. Rivers flooded in predictable ways, leaving behind rich soil. Plants grew back in the same places, season after season. Animals returned along familiar paths. Patterns began to emerge. Reliable patterns. And for the first time, some humans began to notice something new. They didn't have to leave. At first, they stayed only a little longer than usual. A few extra weeks. Maybe a full season. Testing the idea, without fully committing to it. They watched carefully. Would the food last? Would the animals return? Would the land continue to provide? Sometimes it didn't. And when it failed, they moved again. Just as they always had. But in other places. It worked. Seeds dropped into the ground would grow again. Not by accident, but in ways that could be understood. Even encouraged. This was the beginning of something subtle, but powerful. Not quite farming as we know it. Not yet. But the first awareness that humans could influence the land. And once that idea took hold, everything began to shift. If food could be found, or even guided, in one place, then movement was no longer the only option. So some groups stayed. Not forever, at first, but longer than before. Long enough to build simple shelters. Long enough to become familiar with the same stretch of land, not just as a temporary stop, but as something closer to a home. And with staying came change. Possessions became heavier. Tools more specialized. Structures more permanent. Things you couldn't easily carry. Things you didn't need to. Life began to root itself in place. But not everyone made this shift. Many continued to move, following the same ancient rhythms. Tracking animals. Reading the land. Living between places, rather than within one. Two ways of life, slowly emerging. Not in conflict. Just different. Those who stayed. And those who continued on. Both shaped by the same past. But now, beginning to move in different directions. And neither path was easier. Just different kinds of challenges. Different kinds of survival. Migration didn't end. It simply changed. Between movement and stillness. Even as some humans began to settle, The world did not suddenly divide. It wasn't a clean separation. There were no clear lines between those who stayed and those who moved. Instead, there was a long, quiet overlap. Some groups lived in between. They stayed, for part of the year, then moved, when the seasons shifted, returning again, when the land called them back. A kind of rhythm formed. Not constant movement, not permanent stillness, but something in between. These seasonal migrations became deeply understood. A valley in the spring, a river in the summer, higher ground before the cold arrived. And then, back again. The land was no longer just something to pass through. It became something to remember, to revisit, to know, in detail. Over time, these patterns grew more precise. Certain plants would be ready at the same time each year. Animals would return along the same paths. The stars above, marking the passing of time without ever needing to be measured. Knowledge deepened, not just of survival, but of place. And with that knowledge came a different kind of connection. Those who moved constantly knew the world as something vast, open, always changing. Those who stayed began to know the world as something layered, familiar, deeply understood. Neither was more advanced, neither was more primitive. They were simply different ways of being human. Sometimes these groups crossed paths. At river crossings, open plains, coastal edges. Brief encounters. Moments of exchange. Tools, ideas, maybe even stories. Then they would part again, each returning to their own rhythm. But over generations, those rhythms began to shape identity. A person born into a moving life would see the world differently than one born into a settled place. Even if, long ago, their ancestors had been the same. And yet, deep beneath it all, the instinct remained. Even those who settled still carried something ancient within them. A quiet awareness that movement was always possible. That the world was still wide, still open. And sometimes, when the land failed, or conditions changed, even those who had stayed would leave again, because migration was never truly gone. It was simply waiting. The slow shaping of a human world, over long stretches of time, so long they are difficult to truly imagine. These patterns of movement and stillness began to leave marks, not just on people, but on the earth itself. Paths once walked by only a few became known routes. Not roads. Not yet. But remembered directions. A river bend where people often gathered. A valley that offered shelter. A coastline that could be followed for days without losing sight of food or water. These places began to matter. And when people returned to them again and again, they began to change them. Not in dramatic ways. Not at first. But subtly. Fires cleared small patches of land. Plants that were useful were protected, or encouraged. Animals grew familiar with human presence. The landscape, slowly adapting alongside its inhabitants. And in places where people stayed longer, those changes deepened. Temporary shelters became more structured, then rebuilt, then improved. Each time, a little stronger, a little more intentional. What was once a stopping point began to resemble something more permanent. Not cities. Not yet. But beginnings. And as more groups settled in different regions, separated by distance, shaped by different environments, their ways of life continued to diverge. Different tools, different techniques, different understandings of the world. One group might learn to rely on grains that could be stored. Another might depend on seasonal fish runs. Another might follow animals across open plains, never staying long enough to build anything lasting. All of it shaped by where they were. Migration had carried humans across the planet. But now, It was the places themselves that began to shape what came next. Over time, connections formed between groups. Not constant, not organized, but real. Encounters became exchanges. A tool seen in one place might appear, generations later, somewhere far away. An idea, a method, a way of doing something. Quietly traveling, even when people did not. The world was becoming connected. Slowly. Without anyone planning it. And beneath it all, migration still continued. Not always in great journeys across continents, but in smaller movements. From one region to another. From one opportunity to the next. A family leaving a place that no longer provided. A group seeking better conditions just beyond the horizon. The scale had changed. But the instinct remained. Step by step. Choice by choice. The human world was taking shape. Not through a single event, but through countless small movements. Layered over time. And everything that would come later. Every city, every culture, every nation would trace itself back to these quiet beginnings. The memory of movement, even as the world began to take on a more familiar shape. Something deeper remained unchanged. Migration was no longer always about survival in the same immediate way. Not always about escaping drought or following herds. But the instinct never disappeared. It lived on in quieter forms. In the decision to leave a place that no longer felt right. In the pull towards something unknown, just beyond the horizon. In the feeling, difficult to explain, that staying still for too long wasn't enough. This wasn't something learned. It was inherited. Passed down through generations who had walked across continents. Who had crossed lands that no longer exist. Who had survived by moving forward, again and again. That history didn't vanish. It settled into the human mind. A kind of restlessness. A quiet curiosity. The desire to explore, even when there was no immediate need. Over time, this instinct would take on new forms. People would begin to travel not just to survive, but to trade, to discover, to understand. Journeys became intentional. Not just reactions to the environment, but choices. Still shaped by the world, but no longer entirely controlled by it. And yet, even in these new kinds of movement, the past was always there. Every path taken had echoes of older journeys. Every decision to leave carried something ancient within it. Because at its core, migration was never just about land. It was about adaptation. About responding to change. About moving when staying no longer made sense. And that idea would continue to shape human life. Long after the great migrations had slowed. Even today, though the world is mapped, divided, and named, people still move. Across countries. Across continents. Sometimes for opportunity. Sometimes for safety. Sometimes for reasons that are harder to put into words. But always carrying forward the same quiet pattern. The same story. That began with footsteps on open land. The forgotten journeys. Not every journey was remembered. In fact, most weren't. For every path that led to a lasting settlement, there were countless others that simply disappeared. Groups that set out and were never seen again. Not because they failed in some dramatic way, but because the world they moved through was unpredictable. A river might shift course. A once fertile land might dry out. A cold season might last longer than expected. And sometimes, that was enough. There are no records of these journeys. No stories passed down. No traces that remain clear to us now. Only silence. But they mattered. Because migration was never a straight line. It wasn't a clean expansion from one place to another. It was messy, uncertain, full of pauses, reversals, and attempts that didn't last. A group might move forward for years, only to turn back, or split apart, half continuing on, half returning to something familiar. Over time, these small decisions created a web of movement, not a single path, but thousands, crossing, overlapping, fading away. And within that web, only some threads continued, the ones that aligned with the land, with the climate, with the narrow windows of opportunity that opened and closed without warning. This is what shaped the human map. Not just success, but trial. Not just survival, but countless quiet endings that made space for other paths to continue. And because of that, the story of migration isn't just about where humans went. It's also about where they didn't. The paths that could have been taken, but weren't. The lands that were reached, but not held. And the journeys that ended, so others could continue. All of it, part of the same slow unfolding. Climate cycles and the rhythm of movement. For early humans, the world did not stay the same. Not for long. Over tens of thousands of years, the Earth moved through natural climate cycles, periods of cold and warmth that reshaped entire continents. These weren't small seasonal changes. They were massive shifts. Slow, but powerful. During colder periods, what we now call glacial periods, huge portions of the Earth's water became locked in ice. Massive ice sheets spread across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. In some places, these glaciers were over a mile thick. They didn't just sit still. They advanced. As temperatures dropped, ice slowly pushed outward, covering forests, rivers, and entire ecosystems beneath it. Regions that had once supported life became uninhabitable. And when that happened, humans moved. But at the same time, something else occurred. As more water became frozen in glaciers, global sea levels dropped dramatically, sometimes by more than 300 feet. This exposed land that is now underwater. Coastal plains expanded. New migration routes appeared. And most importantly, land bridges formed. One of the most significant of these was the connection between Siberia and Alaska, a region now submerged beneath the Bering Strait. At the time, it was not a narrow crossing. It was a vast stretch of land known as Beringia. Beringia wasn't just a bridge. It was an environment of its own. A cold, dry grassland, sometimes called a mammoth steppe, filled with large animals like woolly mammoths, bison, and caribou. And where those animals lived, humans could survive. This meant that migration wasn't a single crossing event. It likely happened over generations. People didn't simply pass through. Some may have lived there for long periods of time, adapting to the cold, learning the land, and slowly expanding further. Then, as the climate shifted again, the ice began to retreat. Warmer temperatures caused glaciers to melt. Water returned to the oceans. Sea levels rose. And gradually, the land bridge disappeared. What had once been a continuous stretch of land became separated by water, and the people who had crossed it were now isolated. This is how entire populations became separated from one another, not by choice, but by changing geography. Climate didn't just influence migration, it controlled it. Warmer periods opened new regions. Colder periods closed them. A forest might expand, making an area more livable, then shrink again, forcing people out. Rainfall patterns shifted. Grasslands turned into deserts. Deserts sometimes became greener. These weren't one-time events. They repeated. The Earth moved through these cycles again and again, over hundreds of thousands of years. Each time reshaping the landscape. Each time creating new opportunities. And new challenges. And each time, humans responded. sometimes by moving forward, sometimes by retreating, sometimes by adapting in place. This constant interaction between climate and movement created a kind of rhythm, not predictable in the short term, but undeniable over the long term. Migration was not just driven by curiosity or instinct. It was driven by necessity, by survival. And survival, in a changing world, meant staying flexible. Those who could adapt moved when they needed to, stayed when they could, changed when they had to, and over time, this flexibility became one of humanity's greatest strengths. Not strength in the sense of power, but in resilience, the ability to endure change without breaking. How they survived the journey. Migration wasn't just about movement. It was about survival, every single day. Early humans didn't travel through empty land. They moved through environments that were often harsh, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous. Cold winds, intense heat, limited food, unknown terrain. And yet, they endured. One of the most important tools they carried with them was knowledge. Not written knowledge, not recorded, but learned, remembered, and passed on. They understood animal behavior in ways that feel almost unfamiliar today. They could read tracks in the ground, subtle impressions left in mud, sand, or dust. From a single footprint, they could tell how large the animal was, how recently it had passed, whether it was injured or healthy, whether it was alone or part of a group. This wasn't instinct alone. It was observation, built over generations. Hunting itself required patience. Rather than relying on speed or strength, early humans often practiced what's known as persistence hunting. They would track an animal for hours, sometimes even days. Not sprinting, not rushing, but following steadily. Many animals rely on short bursts of speed, but humans had something different: endurance. Their bodies were adapted for long-distance travel. They could regulate heat through sweating. They could maintain a steady pace over long periods. Eventually, the animal would tire. And that was the moment. This method required coordination, communication, trust within the group. Because survival was rarely an individual effort. It was shared. Food, once obtained, wasn't just for one person. It was distributed across the group. This increased the chances of survival for everyone, even those who couldn't hunt. Children, elders, the injured. Migration depended on this kind of cooperation. Because the journey was not always successful. There were days, sometimes longer, when food was scarce. And during those times, the group mattered more than ever. Fire was another critical part of survival. Controlled use of fire dates back hundreds of thousands of years. It provided warmth in cold environments, protection from predators, and perhaps most importantly, it changed how food could be consumed. Cooking made food easier to digest, allowed more nutrients to be absorbed, reduced the risk of illness. It also expanded what could be eaten. Plants that were once too tough or toxic could sometimes be made safe. Meat became more efficient as a food source. Fire also extended the day. After sunset, when darkness would normally end activity, fire created light. A place to gather, to share, to communicate. And in those moments, knowledge was passed on. Not formally, but through repetition. Through demonstration, through shared experience. Clothing, too, played a role, especially as humans moved into colder regions. Early clothing was likely made from animal hides and furs, not stitched in the complex ways we see today at first, but wrapped, layered, adapted as needed. Over time, tools like bone needles allowed for more fitted garments, better insulation, greater protection against cold climates. This made it possible to survive in environments that would have otherwise been impossible. Tools themselves continued to evolve. Stone tools became more refined. Different shapes for different purposes. Cutting, scraping, piercing. Some tools were designed for hunting, others for processing food, others still for building or preparing materials. And as groups moved into new environments, their tools adapted with them. A group near water might develop tools for fishing. One in colder climates might focus on skinning animals efficiently for warmth. Technology, even at this early stage, was not static. It responded to need. Everything they carried, everything they knew, had to be useful. Because migration meant mobility. You could not carry unnecessary weight. You could not rely on anything that didn't serve a purpose. And so, over time, human survival became a balance between movement and efficiency, between knowledge and adaptability, between risk and reward. And through all of it, they continued forward, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Reaching the edges of the world. By around 70,000 years ago, humans had already begun moving far beyond their original homeland in Africa. Not all at once, not in a single wave, but gradually, in small groups, over thousands of years. One of the earliest major expansions moved into the Middle East, then outward into Asia. From there, paths began to split. Some groups moved inland, across open grasslands and river systems. Others followed coastlines, staying close to the edge of the sea where food was more predictable. This coastal movement would become one of the most important migration routes in human history, because it led to a place that, even today, feels distant. The continent of Australia. Humans are believed to have reached Australia at least 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. Possibly earlier. But getting there required something new. Water crossings. Even at times when sea levels were lower, Australia was never fully connected to mainland Asia. There were always stretches of open water. This means that early humans must have developed some form of simple watercraft. Not large ships. Not complex vessels. But enough. Enough to carry small groups across short distances. Island to island. Step by step. This wasn't a single journey. It likely happened over generations. People moving gradually through what is now Southeast Asia, eventually reaching the northern edges of Australia. Once there, they adapted. Australia was unlike any environment humans had encountered before. Unique animals, different climates, vast, open landscapes. And yet, they survived, developing new tools, new strategies, new ways of living that matched the land. At the same time, far to the north, another major movement was taking shape. Across the land bridge of Beringia, humans began entering the Americas. This likely occurred in multiple waves, between roughly 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Some groups may have traveled along the interior, through ice-free corridors that opened between massive glaciers. Others likely followed the coastline, moving south along the edge of the Pacific. Both routes were difficult. The interior path required navigating between towering ice sheets. Cold, unstable, dangerous. The coastal route required adapting to marine environments, relying on fishing, shoreline resources, and constant movement. But over time, humans spread southward, through North America, into Central America, and eventually into South America. reaching the southern tip of the continent, what is now Patagonia, within a few thousand years. A distance of thousands of miles, crossed without roads, without maps, only through knowledge, adaptation, and movement. Meanwhile, other groups moved into Europe, facing colder climates, longer winters, and environments shaped by glaciers. Here, survival required different strategies: more insulation, more planning, more storage of food, and still, they spread across nearly every habitable part of the planet. By around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, humans could be found on almost every continent except Antarctica. Not because they conquered the Earth in a single effort, but because over tens of thousands of years, they never stopped moving, even when the distances were vast, even when the environments were unfamiliar. They adapted, again and again, and in doing so, they reached the edges of the world, not as explorers in the modern sense, but as survivors, following the same pattern that had always guided them. Step forward, adjust, continue. Isolation and the rise of different worlds. As humans spread across the Earth, distance began to do more than just separate groups physically. It began to create entirely different worlds. Not worlds in the sense of planets, but in the way life was lived, understood, experienced. When groups became isolated, by mountains, oceans, deserts, or sheer distance, they no longer shared knowledge as easily. What one group discovered, another might never know. And so, slowly, human life began to take many different forms. In places like Australia, isolation lasted for tens of thousands of years. The people who lived there developed cultures deeply connected to the land. They understood seasonal patterns in extraordinary detail. Not just broad changes, but subtle shifts. The timing of plant growth, animal movements, even environmental signals that were difficult to notice unless you had lived there your entire life. Fire, for example, was used in controlled ways to shape the land, not to destroy it, but to manage it. Small, intentional burns encouraged new plant growth, attracted animals, reduced the risk of larger, uncontrollable fires. This wasn't random. It was environmental knowledge, refined over generations. In other regions, different innovations appeared. In colder parts of Europe and Asia, humans developed more advanced clothing, layered garments, tailored using bone needles. Shelters became more insulated, sometimes built partially underground to retain heat. Food storage became critical. Drying meat, preserving resources to survive long winters. These weren't optional improvements. They were necessary. Meanwhile, in regions with abundant plant life, different strategies emerged. Instead of following large animals, some groups began to rely more heavily on gathering, understanding which plants were edible, which were seasonal, which needed preparation to be safe. This required detailed knowledge, not just of the present, but of time. When something would grow, where it would grow, how long it would last. And because these environments were different, the tools used within them also became different. Stone tools in one region might be shaped in ways that made sense for hunting large animals. In another, tools might be smaller, more precise, suited for processing plants or fish. Over time, these differences became more pronounced. Not because people were becoming fundamentally different, but because their environments demanded different solutions. Even ways of thinking began to diverge. A group constantly moving across open land might think in terms of distance, direction, seasonal movement. A group living in one place might think more in terms of cycles, patterns, changes within a single environment. Neither was better. Both were deeply adapted. And because these groups were often separated for thousands of years, their knowledge systems grew independently, creating entirely unique ways of understanding the world. And yet, all of it traced back to the same origin, the same early migrations, the same footsteps that carried humans outward. What began as a single shared journey had now become many different stories, all unfolding at the same time, across the same planet. The first connections. For a long time, distance meant separation. Mountains, oceans, and vast stretches of land made it difficult for groups to interact regularly. But distance was never absolute. Over time, paths began to overlap again. Not in massive, organized systems. Not yet. But in small, quiet encounters. A group moving through a familiar route might arrive at a place and find signs that others had been there. A fire pit, discarded tools, footprints, evidence of another presence. Sometimes they would meet at river crossings, seasonal gathering points, or places where resources were abundant. These meetings were not always predictable, sometimes cautious, sometimes brief, but important, because in those moments, something new began to happen. Exchange, not just of goods, but of knowledge. A tool design seen in one group might be remembered and recreated elsewhere. A technique for preparing food, a way of shaping stone, a method for tracking animals. These ideas moved between people, even when people themselves did not travel far. This is how early forms of trade began. Not structured, not formal, but real. Objects, too, began to move. Stone from one region might appear far from its source. Shells from coastal areas might be found deep inland. These weren't accidents. They were carried, passed from one group to another, over time, over distance. A network was forming, not visible on any map, but present, a slow web of connections stretching across regions. And as these connections grew, so did the flow of ideas. Innovation was no longer isolated. A discovery made in one place could eventually influence life somewhere else. Not quickly, not instantly, but gradually, and over generations. These small exchanges began to shape larger patterns. Groups that had once been completely separate now shared fragments of knowledge. Different, but no longer entirely disconnected. Migration had spread humans across the earth. Now, connection was beginning to bring them back together. Not as one group again, but as many, linked by movement, exchange, and shared understanding. And this process would only continue. When humans began to shape the land, for most of human history, the land shaped people. Where you could go, what you could eat, how you survived. All of it depended on the environment. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that relationship began to change. Humans started to shape the land in return. This shift did not happen everywhere at once. It appeared in different parts of the world, at different times, in different ways. But the pattern was similar. People began to notice something simple and powerful. Seeds that fell into the ground sometimes grew, not randomly, not unpredictably, but in ways that could be observed. If seeds were dropped near water, they grew more reliably. If certain plants were returned to the same place, they appeared again. At first, this wasn't farming. It was something much smaller, encouraging growth, returning to the same locations. protecting useful plants from being disturbed. Over time, these small actions became more intentional. People began to clear land, removing competing plants, loosening soil, planting seeds deliberately. And once that began, a new possibility emerged. Food could be produced, not just found. This was one of the most significant changes in human history, because it reduced uncertainty. Instead of relying entirely on migration, on following animals or seasonal plants, people could begin to stay in one place and bring food to them. But this did not make life easier. Not at first. Early agriculture was demanding. It required time, planning, consistency. Crops had to be planted at the right moment, watered when possible, protected from animals, and then waited on. Failure was always possible. A change in weather, too much rain, not enough rain, could destroy everything. Unlike migration, where a group could move if resources failed, farming tied people to a place. If the land failed, you couldn't simply leave immediately. This created a different kind of risk. But it also created something new: stability. When crops succeeded, they produced more food than was immediately needed. For the first time, surplus became possible. Food could be stored, saved, used later. This changed everything. Because when food is no longer needed every single day, time opens up. People can do more than just survive. They can build, experiment, develop new tools, and slowly, settlements began to grow. Not temporary shelters, not seasonal camps, but places that were returned to again and again, until eventually, they were never left. These early settlements were still small, but they were different. Structures became more permanent, walls reinforced, spaces organized, and as more people stayed in one place, population increased. More people could be supported. Because food production was more consistent, this created a feedback loop. More people meant more labor. More labor meant more food. More food meant more people. And slowly, communities expanded. But agriculture didn't just change how people lived. It changed how they moved. Migration did not disappear. But it became less constant, less necessary. Instead of moving continuously across the land, people began to move between fixed points. From one settlement to another, from farmland to nearby regions, movement became more localized, more structured, and over time, more intentional. Trade routes expanded. Instead of passing goods randomly between groups, people began traveling specific paths, carrying resources that were not available everywhere. Grain, tools, materials like obsidian or flint. These routes became the early foundations of larger networks, connecting settlements across increasing distances. And with these connections, ideas moved faster, farming techniques improved, tools became more specialized, knowledge spread more efficiently. But this shift also created new challenges. Settlements meant competition. Land became valuable. Water sources became critical. And as populations grew, conflicts began to appear. Not constant, not universal, but present. Because staying in one place meant defending that place. Something that had not been necessary in the same way during constant migration. At the same time, health began to change. Living close together increased the spread of disease. Reliance on fewer food sources could lead to nutritional imbalances. Agriculture provided stability, but introduced new vulnerabilities. Still, it continued to spread because the advantages were powerful. The ability to remain in one place, to build, to grow, to store. And as this way of life expanded across different regions of the world, it began to form the foundation for something much larger: civilization. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, built on the simple idea that humans could shape the land, instead of only following it. And yet, even as fields replaced wild landscapes, even as settlements grew into villages, and villages into cities, migration never fully disappeared. It adapted, because no matter how stable life became, the world itself continued to change. And when it did, humans, as they always had, moved. The echo of footsteps. In the end, there is no single moment where migration stops, no clear line where movement becomes stillness. Because even now, in a world mapped and measured, humans continue to move across cities, across countries, across oceans, sometimes for opportunity, sometimes for survival, sometimes for reasons that are harder to explain. But beneath all of it, the same pattern remains, the same quiet instinct that began tens of thousands of years ago, long before roads, before borders, before names. There were only footsteps, small groups moving through an unfamiliar world, guided by memory, by instinct, by the need to continue. They followed rivers they did not name, crossed lands that no longer exist, watched stars they could not yet describe, but somehow understood. They adapted, again and again, to cold, to heat, to change, and in doing so, they spread across the earth, not as conquerors, not as explorers in the way we think of them now, but as survivors, carrying everything they needed, in their minds, in their bodies, in each other. Every city that exists today, every language, every culture, can trace itself back to those early movements, to decisions made without certainty, without guarantees, only with the understanding that staying still was not always possible. And so they moved, step by step, generation by generation, across a world that was constantly changing. And even now, that movement continues, in quieter ways. A decision to leave, a journey towards something new, a life built somewhere unfamiliar. Different reasons, different scales, but the same story. Because migration was never just about survival. It was about becoming, about changing with the world, instead of resisting it. And somewhere, deep within that history, there is a simple truth: that no matter how far we've come, no matter how much we've built, we are still creatures of movement, still shaped by the paths we take. And in the quiet moments, when everything slows, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, endless, the echo of footsteps. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, I hope this journey helped you slow down and drift, just a little, from the first footsteps across open land to the quiet shaping of the world we know today. This story was never rushed, and neither are you. If you enjoyed this, you can let the video continue, or simply rest here for a while. And if you'd like to return, there will always be more stories waiting. Until then, sleep well.